I think the reality is that the coalition were quite happy to define themselves against things which had come before. So there was a mood at the time, and I think there was a little bit of evaluation at the time from the Treasury. Was Sure Start really worth the money? Had it really had an impact? Was it really helping the poorest children? Was it just another sort of big wasteful labour programme which we could ditch instead spend on childcare? And, the huge frustration, this is just the nature of politics in government. If Christine's report had been published in January 2010, what an impact it would have had.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and today we're going to be looking back at one of the most ambitious policies introduced in England for young people, and that's Sure Start, for very young people on the whole. Launched by the Labour government back in 1999, Sure Start was aimed at giving every child, but particularly the poorest children, a much better start in life by bringing together early education, childcare, health services, and parental support under one roof. At its peak, more than 3,000 centres were operating across the country. But since 2010, the programme has been scaled right back, funding has been cut by around 2/3, and what remains is very different to what was originally implemented. So what difference did Sure Start make? How was it implemented? Why does it still actually shape today's debates around early years services? To explore all this, I'm joined by Christine Farquharson, who's an Associate Director here at the IFS and runs all of our work on early years in particular and education in general, and was one of the authors of a major new study looking at the long-run impacts of Sure Start. I'm also delighted to say we're joined by Ed Balls, of course, host of his rival podcast with George Osborne, Political Currency, also a TV presenter and academic at the moment, but more importantly for the point of view of this podcast, he was an advisor to Gordon Brown in the Treasury back in the late 1990s, and therefore was there at the implementation of Sure Start. And he was also Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families, which was the department responsible for Sure Start. He was there at the end of the 2000s. So welcome, Ed. Welcome, Christine. Let's start. Not all listeners will be entirely familiar with what Sure Start actually was, what it was intended to do, and how it worked. So maybe, Ed, if you could start us off just by maybe talking us through the origins. I mean, this was one of the big new policies of that last Labour government that you were such a big part of. How did it come about? What were its aims, and what was it?
It was very exciting and sort of crept up on us a bit unawares over the course of the autumn of 1997 and the spring of 1998. There was a new Labour government. We had said to the Treasury that one of the Treasury's goals was to reduce child poverty, which was a bit of a shift for the institution. Our focus was on introducing the national minimum wage combined with what we called the Working Families Tax Credit, which was about boosting the incomes of lower paid workers, but also people who were out of work alongside child benefits. So that was the core of our child poverty strategy to begin with. But in that first spending review, as well as the normal reviews of individual departments, there were a number of cross-cutting reviews, and one which was set up, driven by a great director at the Treasury called Norman Glass, was to look at whether there were things you could do to tackle the long-term causes of child poverty and deprivation through using more effective and in particular more joined up provision of services in local communities. And that review kind of worked with people from education and health and from local government. And over that first few months of the spending review, Gordon Brown personally became very excited about this. And, I got involved in it because Gordon said, this is such a big deal. We're going to have to go through it. And so one of the big announcements in the summer of 98 was 250 areas, a nationally provided program. I think it was about 450 million over the first spending review to invest in joining up services for the most disadvantaged children, getting parents involved, and trying to do something very different. So, for example, from the beginning, it was decided there was a director called Naomi Eisenstadt. She was to be, I think she was located, the Sure Start unit was located in the education department, but the minister in charge of it was a health minister. First of all, Tessa Jowell, and then Yvette Cooper, public health minister, who I'm married to, was the very quickly the minister. So the conscious decision was, if you had a minister in one department in charge of a program being delivered by another department, would you start at the national level to force that kind of joining up of the delivery of services, which we were trying to do through Sure Start? And so at the time, it was new, it was innovative, it was exciting, but I don't think anybody knew if it was going to work or to make a difference. It was necessarily very long term. As I was saying to Christine when we did the event launching her excellent paper, we had a knock on our door in the autumn, I think, of 1999, in Castleford, where we live in West Yorkshire, where Yvette at the time was the MP, and it was a person with a clipboard to say, we are doing the Sure Start evaluation, and we need you to ask you some questions. And I'd gone to the door and I called Yvette and said, they're doing a Sure Start evaluation, but I'm not totally sure why they'd come to us. And it turned out, because our first child had been born in June 1999, the area we were living, quite a deprived part of Castleford in West Yorkshire, and we were just in the evaluation, and we had to point out to them that, to be honest, given that Yvette is the health minister in charge of the national programme, her answers might be slightly biased in this sample, and therefore it's not totally clear that we are, a good data point for you to have. But I make that point to say that from the beginning, because it was new and innovative and different, as well as that cross-departmental drive, it was also, from the beginning, we set out to evaluate, to try and understand if it was going to work. And I think the other thing, just to say, the last thing I'll say from the start, there had been antecedents of this. There was a thing called Home Start, which started in the 1970s in the Midlands. And this was parents supporting other parents in order to navigate the system and help to bring up their kids. And from the beginning, the philosophy was, you didn't want this to look like a government program with experts and professionals as much as you wanted the community to own it, and for the face of Sure Start to be parents talking to parents, to sort of to reduce some of those barriers to people getting through the door. I don't want to go there if it has a statutory sign on the door front. So there was lots of ways in which we were trying to do it in a different way, but in the end, at the start, there was no evidence base at all, just a hope that if you got early help on health and education and parental support, that would make a difference to child outcomes.
I think that's a little harsh on the lack of evidence base, Christine, in the sense that there had been similar sorts of programs run in the US where there was some decent evidence on that. But what's your sense, Christine, of how this then developed and the extent to which it met the sorts of characteristics that Ed has just described?
So on the evidence-based point first, you're right that this was very much drawing from programs in the US. But what we knew from the US was that a really small-scale, super intensive researcher-led program in the 1960s in the US working with Black families, so think about the poverty, think about the racism, think about the headwinds those families faced, that really model intervention could make big and long-lasting differences. What I think we didn't know at all was whether if you took that and you put that into a different context with, mercifully, slightly less in the way of racism and slightly less in the way of extreme deprivation and slightly more in the way of other services, and then you rolled that out across the country and made it much lighter touch, was that still going to be a successful model? So I think that was the gamble, and that was where the question mark was. And I think what we knew in the very first years of Sure Start was that whether or not this thing was making a difference for children and their families, the families really liked it. So Ed said, you start with 250 local programs. Quite quickly, that becomes, we're going to do 500 local programs. And then a couple of years after that, it becomes the only question that MPs are getting is, why doesn't my constituency have a Sure Start? And when do I get my Sure Start? And, please, can I have Sure Start? And so at that point, the political decision was, well, let's have a children's centre in every community. Let's rebrand a little bit and make this a truly universal offer across England. That was really when Sure Start hit scale. So when you talk about sort of 3,000 centres operating in 2010, this was a big network, and it was a big part of England's early years infrastructure. It took it took up about a third of early years spending by the time it hit its peak. So this was something that, originally started as a bit of a let's take a gamble, let's see what we can do here, and then became quite wildly popular and the government really doubled down on.
Ed, you became Secretary of State in, was it 2008 or 2007? And that would have been one of the big programs that you were responsible for at that time.
That's right. But I think that the tussles and the evolution Christine talked about had really happened between the 2002 spending reviews and 2007. And there were some big issues and some big arguments in Whitehall about this program. And as is always the case in Whitehall, I don't think that anybody doubted it was popular. And as Christine said, I don't think anybody doubted that it was that there was a strong desire for it to become more widespread. But first of all, I think that there was a lot of pressure on the education. It was at the time, I think it was DFE, so it would have been kind of it was education and work. That was the original Blunkett department. A lot of pressure coming, including from the Treasury, about getting people back to work, including getting lone parents back to work. And did we have an adequate childcare offer in order to facilitate those unemployment to work transitions? And so there's no doubt that in the education department, they really wanted this to skew towards providing childcare. And to some extent that happened. But although, as I said, there was a pressure from the Treasury and number 10 for the work element, I think that the original flame of Sure Start was about kind of tackling long-term poverty through prevention. And therefore, we all fought very hard to stop this being a DFE childcare takeover. But there's no doubt that childcare became part of the package. The second thing was that I think number 10, the Tony Blair view of the world, was that he preferred the idea of services being provided to families, and he didn't really want it to be, he didn't want New Labour to be the government of the poorest families. And so there was definitely a pressure from number 10 to universalise this, and with a lot of resistance from the Treasury to saying you mustn't lose its essence, which is children who are not being spoken to at home, every child a talker, parents who are not coming into Sure Start centres because they're afraid of the state authority, the people who don't get a follow-up health visit because they never make the appointment. But then the third thing was, from the Treasury, I think that we did have a philosophy at the time, a political philosophy, I think you could call it, which we called progressive universalism, which was that the more the welfare state was touching the lives universally of all, the easier it was then to say support for all, but more support for those who need it most. And so if you think about tax credits, we wanted the working families tax credit to be paid through the tax system because everybody pretty much pays tax. And therefore that was like a universal thing. It wasn't a welfare benefit only for some. And similarly, we liked the idea of children's centres being something which were in every community, because that embedded it as part of everybody's lives. It made it part of the universal welfare state within which you could then say, but a lot of targeting of resource and effort on those children who need it most. And that is, I think, how we kind of intellectually reconciled our desire to keep it as an anti-poverty program with number 10's desire for it to be for all, and DFE's desire for it to include childcare, which was, if you had some things in here, if all health visitor, if all kind of first week checks were being done in the children's centre, that meant everybody was coming in for that. And then within that, you could hook others in to things which became much more intensive and supportive and consistent with that original vision Christine described about prevention for the most in need. And so we didn't resist that universalization. We actually saw it as an advantage, as a way of entrenching this as part of everybody's experience, because we thought that was our best way. It turned out to be wrong, by the way. We thought that was our best way of entrenching this as an anti-poverty program. So when you say, Paul, you said in your Times article, that it was a mistake to broaden. I think we consciously were thinking that this was a way to entrench this and make it part of the underlying infrastructure, a bit like child benefit was, or a bit like the universal pension, or a bit like going to reception in primary school, things which everybody does and experiences and feels it's not just for them, it's also for us.
Can I ask on that? So that's a really strong political argument that says if we make this universal, then it will build a popular consensus around it. When I talk to people who were involved in the more operational or delivery side of Sure Start, the argument that they always tell me is one that's much more about screening and the difficulty of working out who is disadvantaged before service providers start seeing that child or seeing that family. And so I think for them, that push for universalism and that push for this being a place that every family goes to was much more about, we don't know until those families show up who are the children who need that extra support, who are the parents who are going to benefit from these services.
I'm sure that in some places that was true. And my experience, by the time we got to 2007, 2010, when we had, as you said, 3,500 children's centres, the variation across the country in the commitment and the sophistication of the leadership was quite wide. So you go to some children's centres where absolutely the focus was on getting the most disadvantaged children, using lots of parents who'd come through children to then be outreach workers to go after them. But if you're really worried about people falling through the cracks, then the more you could get people face to face, the more chance you had. And that is why those places would want health services in particular, pre and then post birth maternity services to be located in the children's centre, because that was something which everybody was likely to do, to see the midwife, to see the health visitor. You went to other places in the country where health was entirely disconnected, and the local authority leadership didn't really see that as being a problem. And what they wanted to do was to make sure that the centre was built and well staffed, but there was insufficient focus on who was really coming through the door. They tended to be the places in which you had fewer parents doing outreach. I then had, I had arguments with Tessa Jow. Tessa went through a phase of wanting parents to take over the running of the children's centres. And there was a little bit of that when you go back to the original Sure Start report and New Deal for Communities. If it is owned by the people who really need it most, they're more likely to value it and to support it. But the danger is that they don't end up being the people who actually are coming in, let alone running it. And the danger is it gets taken over by a group of less needy, more affluent parents who quite like this sort of childcare family hub type place, but don't really see it as part of their drive to find, as you said, Christine, the people who really need to come in. And there were always tensions between different motives and different kind of goals and different degrees of application. And the original Sure Start was a national program. You couldn't deliver on scale without going through local authorities. Even with the ring fence, it was hard to police the detail of delivery. So there was inevitably a lot of variation. And again, Paul says in his Times article that the ministers and advisors needed to be more comfortable with the variation and difference you get through local delivery, which is true, other than the fact that if you're the Secretary of State at the centre and you've got this really, really powerful program which can tackle child poverty for the long term, and they're doing that really, really well in Hull. Well, but if parents live in Bristol, the fact it's really good in Hull isn't really good enough because they want it in Bristol too, and you want it in Bristol too. So how do you make that happen? And the tension between knowing that the program could work, but wanting to trust local delivery when actually some of the local deliverers had a different view about what working meant that is just inherent in delivery in our political system.
Yeah, that's a microcosm of the difficulty of centralised state delivery from Whitehall. And on the one hand, you want to make sure everything is as good as possible everywhere, and feeling comfortable devolving to local authorities or other regional areas, and that it's true. I mean, at one level, it's true of schools and hospitals as much as it is of anything else. It's it's absolutely fundamental to the problem, I think, of governing in the country.
It is, but there is an aspect here which it goes back to Christine's work, which is that if you're doing the ambulance service and you devolve that, and somebody rings 999, does the ambulance come? And you can measure that, but also you'll hear very quickly if it doesn't. But this isn't about an emergency service. This is about things which are preventative and very long term, really hard to measure at the time it's happening. I mean, it's only years afterwards you really get the data. And so it's very at the center. If you are trusting local delivery of an emergency service, that is actually much, much easier to see how you do that. Whereas if it's a long-term preventative service, it's so easy for that just not to be the priority, for the money to be diverted elsewhere, for them not to really care about the things which really work in terms of prevention. And so I do think that Sure Start, because it was long-term and preventative, meant that problem of national program local delivery was more acute than in schooling or in many health services or in policing, for example.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And the big change after 2010 is that ring fence was taken away, and exactly as you might expect at that point, with very, very tight settlements for local government, spending fell very, very fast, and a lot of these Sure Start children's centres either shut altogether or started providing much, much more limited services. And it's interesting, and I mean, given how popular it was, as both you and Christine have described, there's not been that much kickback. I mean, in the end, if you my sense is that the political cost of doing that was pretty small.
People notice the absence of an immediate emergency service, something they need right then, something which is that they had used when they were younger, and they expect to be provided in for people like them when they are older. Think how hard it is for schools to change the hours of the school or the way they structure themselves, because people are so used to patterns. And so I think that the people who were most likely to benefit were the people who are less likely to make a noise, because they were the ones you're always fighting to get into Sure Start in the first place. And as parents moved through, the next generation of parents, there was just something which wasn't available to them, which they kind of weren't expecting to be there anyway, because it wasn't like they'd gone to the Sure Start Children's Centre 20 years ago. And then it was interesting. I talked to George Osborne about this. Christine asked us a question on our Political Currency podcast about the nature of this and the ring fence and why it happened. Why did the Liberal Democrats in the coalition choose to prioritise childcare? And I think in the end, I think it was a Labour programme. I think it was very associated with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in particular. And so in 2010, politically, things moved on. And as I said at the event I was at with you, Christine, a couple of weeks ago, I sat down at a dinner a couple of years ago with Michael Gove, who took over from me as education. He changed the department from children's schools and families to education. And he said to this group of past education secretaries, David Blunkett, Ruth Kelly, they were all there, a number of Justin Greening. He said, it was such a mistake I made, he said, in 2010, to move away from all of the stuff which was about child poverty and tackling the barriers in the earliest years, in particular, to children learning. Because what you realize as an education secretary is for all you're doing about teaching and the curriculum in schools, those are the things which, if they're not there, really start to hold you back and to deny opportunity. But the failure I had in 2010 was to persuade Michael that this was so important that it should become part of the consensus he would carry on. And I think the reality is that the coalition were quite happy to define themselves against things which had come before. So there was a mood at the time. And I think there was a little bit of evaluation at the time from the Treasury was Sure Start really worth the money? Was it value for money? Had it really had an impact? Was it really helping the poorest children? Was it just another sort of big wasteful labor program which we could ditch and instead spend on childcare? And the huge frustration. This is just the nature of politics in government. If Christine's report had been published in January 2010, what an impact it would have had. A report which says that the benefits more than twice outweigh the costs of a program and last 20 years, an impact on education outcomes, health outcomes, and behavioral and kind of life happiness outcomes as well. It's amazing. And we never, ever had that ammunition. And, I'd be interested to know whether there's things we should have done differently to get the ammunition pre-2010. But I think, at the time, it was for a range of those reasons, it was easy to ditch, and it was such a mistake.
So, Christine, do you want to? Ed's given you the perfect opening there to talk about your evaluation and defend yourself against the accusation. You should have been doing this before you were even working at the IFS.
I'm going to defend myself by the fact I was still in Canada at that point. But
it's all very well, Christine. It's all very well.
I know.
But it's all very well. Excuses.
It is. One of the so I always struggle with cohorts when I'm doing research projects. And Sure Start was lovely because I was born in what would have been the very first cohort to have any exposure to Sure Start. So that made it very easy to keep track of my birth years doing this. Anyway, so the evaluation that we did is quite wide-ranging. There were evaluations that had been done previously, so one in the early 2000s and then one in 2010. What our work does is it is able to, first of all, look at Sure Start across the whole span of the program, so not just a couple of years at the beginning or a snapshot at the end. And then we're also, because we're doing this later on, we're also able to follow up those children for a much longer time than the previous evaluations were. And that turns out to be really important, actually, because I think that the big picture fact of our evaluation is the benefits we're finding are pretty wide-ranging. They cover a lot of different outcomes. And actually, they're very long-lasting. So we look up until children are about 15, 16 years old, and we see that those benefits persist and actually, in many cases, are getting bigger as those children get older. And that's quite surprising because these kids are going to Sure Start between 0 and 4. And then yet somehow these benefits are still lasting until their teenage years and actually even getting bigger throughout their teenage years. So that's quite a win for a policy, to be honest. And I think that speaks as well to the difficulty of how do you make these decisions early on, or if there's pressure to evaluate after a year or after 2 years, what is it that you find? So for example, on the hospitalization side, we actually find that in the very short term, age 1, age 2, having access to Sure Start increases your risk of being hospitalized. And that's largely about infections. Basically, you're putting lots of germy, snotty kids in a corner together, and unsurprisingly, they get sick, and then some of them need to be taken to hospital. But that short-run story isn't the full picture. So if you then look to age 5, age 6, you see hospitalizations drop quite a lot. And a lot of that is about infections that those kids had early in life. Their immune system kind of developed and got better. And so they were getting less sick later on. But then these persistent benefits kind of last all the way through the teenage years. And that goes beyond infections. That's about fewer accidents, fewer injuries, maybe a safer home environment, stronger parenting support. So this kind of cocktail. On the education side, it's a similar story. We see benefits at age 5, but the benefits we get at age 16 when we're looking at GCSE results are sort of 2 to 3 times as big as the benefits that we saw at age 5. So there's this pattern where these benefits are growing over time, and it means that those really short-term evaluations aren't necessarily picking up the full picture, which makes it very difficult to defend. We also look at a range of other services, absences and exclusions and special educational needs and crime. Big picture, across a wide range of outcomes, Sure Start is making a difference, a positive difference in children's lives. It's not a silver bullet. So in particular, when you look at those really intensive high-cost services like education, health, and care plans, that sort of highest level of special educational needs support, or children's social care system and children being looked after by the state, or young people who are getting sort of convicted and sent to jail, those outcomes we're not finding any difference on. And so to me, that says, Sure Start did a really good job at a population-wide level of improving outcomes to a significant and measurable extent. And that has real value for the country, that has real value for those children. But if what you want to do is really look at that super high cost spending or those super vulnerable kids with really high needs, you're always going to need something more intensive. A Sure Start center where families are kind of going in for a couple of hours a week, that's not going to be the right service offer for those kids. And so you always have to think about this as the early years landscape and what's the set of services that we have, not just we're going to double down on Sure Start to the exclusion of all else.
The problem here from a policy point of view, as Ed was suggesting, is that inevitably these evaluations of the kind that you're describing come sometime after the policy, and the speed at which government works requires this sort of almost immediately. So it's an extremely difficult thing to match up the evidence to the policy. And having worked to some extent on either side of this, I know that each side gets slightly frustrated with the other. The politicians want the analysis straight away, and the analysts don't understand why the politicians quite get that it takes rather longer to achieve that. But I mean, that is a good news story. And I suppose the question, coming into the 2025 where we are, there's some very good evidence here now that this is a good policy. And there isn't nothing available now, is there? I mean, what is the sort of somewhat half-hearted replacement that we do have at the moment? I think this is probably something that a lot of listeners will be less familiar with. They are with the old Sure Start system.
Well, I mean, the biggest replacement that we have is free childcare spending. So, at a big picture level, what's happened in the early years is we've taken money out of Sure Start and we've put a lot more money into funded childcare than we had before. So that's the big picture story. But you're right, Paul. In the last few years, going back to the previous government as well, there has been this sense of actually perhaps something was lost, and perhaps Ed has belatedly made his case to Michael Gove and to others. And so there has been the introduction of this program called Family Hubs. Family Hubs have a lot of similarities to Sure Start. So they're meant to be one-stop shops. They're meant to bring together quite a similar set of services. They're meant to be sort of based in the local community, and local authorities have a really big role in both funding and delivering those hubs. There are differences here as well. So the biggest difference is one of scale. If you look at spending on Sure Start at its peak, you're looking at something like £2 billion a year in today's prices. If you look at spending on Family Hubs, even if you take a sort of really generous view of local authority account documents, you're getting to maybe 500 million, 600 million. So you're just nowhere close in terms of the scale of resource here. And you're nowhere close in terms of the network either. We only have Family Hubs in about 75 local authorities, so about half. There was a commitment at the spending review last week to say, oh, well, we think we want to do more on Family Hubs. We think we want to go further here. But I didn't see a lot of detail in that document. And if there was funding attached to that, it was so small that it got lost in the rounding of the fiscal numbers in those tables. So I think we are a bit wait and see to work out how this offer gets taken forward. And also, what's the best design? So Family Hubs are also distinct from Sure Start in that they cover all the way from 0 to age 19, whereas Sure Start was very much 0 to 4. That could be a really good thing. That could mean that you're joining up services across this child's whole life. That could also mean that if you've got a bunch of, 17-year-olds running around the center playing basketball or doing some sort of activity, and somebody else is a mum with a 1-year-old, is that really going to be a comfortable environment? How do you think about designing that environment for those different age groups? So there are ways in which Family Hubs are different to Sure Start, but there is, I think, that ambition of actually, bringing together these different services probably wasn't a bad idea and probably is quite a helpful thing for children and their families. And so maybe we should try and take some steps back towards that.
Ed, it's a difficult moment to be doing it, given how little money there is knocking around. I mean, what's your sense of the current politics of the capacity to move in this direction, given that, as you say, it's not an emergency service. It's not something that everyone, the electorate aren't clamoring for it. So when you've got limited resources, it's going to struggle to get to the top of the pile, isn't it?
Well, I think that is right. But I think that is not only about money and fiscal constraint. I think the research Christine's done and her team's brilliant. And I think it will end up having a big and lasting impact and will change things again. So I'm an optimist. But I think three things. First of all, we shouldn't dismiss the importance of that investment in childcare, not only because of the impact upon kind of incomes of families who are supported into work, and therefore the impact upon the life chances of children in those families, especially families who otherwise would have been workless, but also that the more you have a professional kind of workforce in early years doing versions of, EYFS. I think I introduced that back in, well, I was there when we introduced it back in 2007-8. But if you have a curriculum and an approach and an inspection regime and a culture in childcare, which is about supporting children to develop as well as to be looked after, but with people who are looking for warning signs that can give you some of that sorting mechanism, which Sure Start did do. It is true that the child in greatest need needs more than 2 hours in a Sure Start Children's Centre. But the issue is who spots the problem and makes a referral. And childcare can do that as well. So I don't think we should, it's important not to narrow your ambition with the childcare spending. Secondly, in the end, nothing becomes permanent and part of our system unless it becomes consensual. And in the early 2010s, Sure Start was rejected. But by the time you get to the latter part of the Conservative government, it wasn't Labour who's introduced family hubs and Start for Life. It was the previous Conservative government, and you were starting. So there is, I think, that cross-party consensus about the need for action. And I think you'd have to be relaxed and think, if we end up with a brilliant universal childcare service which really targets needs and deprivation in 10 years' time, this journey will have been worth it, even if it was a bit frustrating along the way. So I don't think you could say your research came too late, but maybe it's actually just come a bit early or at the right time. And it's going to, if we'd had your research in 97, we maybe would have moved faster. But then that goes to the third point, which is, of course, it is the case. There's fiscal restraint. But I don't think it's only about that. I also think it's about what the Treasury and Number 10 decides. And I don't think Bridget Phillipson or the Education Secretary will drive this alone. And in the end, the question is, does the Prime Minister and the Chancellor think this is really important? And does the Chancellor think part of their goal is to, as I said, when we arrived in the Treasury in 1997, Terry Burns was a bit taken aback, the Permanent Secretary, when I said to him, we want to rewrite the Treasury's missions because one of our missions is to reduce child poverty. And he said, well, that has not traditionally been part of the Treasury's objectives. And isn't that for another department? And we said, well, no, absolutely not, because we want everything we're doing to be judged against that lens, as well as growth and low inflation. And I think in the end, you need that breadth of ambition from the Treasury and Number 10 for this kind of program to really be driven through the system in local government and education. And it's a new government. And as I said, we didn't come in 97 knowing we were going to do Sure Start, but we came in thinking this should be a goal. And so I think the question is for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, independent of the fiscal constraint, is this important? And if it is, what are they doing to lay the ground now so that at the point when there is resource, they can move in a more decisive way? And so, I'm not as close to it as Christine, but my worry is that this is not as much part of the narrative of the government and the Treasury and Number 10 as I would like. And I don't think that's, of course, there's fiscal constraints, but actually, governments also have missions which they plan for the long term. And so I would like this to be a bigger part of their thinking and talking.
I think that point about the fiscal constraint and the importance of political willpower is really important, actually, because if you look at spending on Sure Start, $2 billion a year is a lot. we're spending 4 billion, possibly more like 5 billion extra a year on these new childcare entitlements that were announced in March 2023. So that scale of program spending is not unheard of. And there are choices. The early years budget has got a lot bigger. There are choices about, even within that budget, how do you allocate? I think, I completely agree, by the way, that the childcare entitlements have a lot of value. And I don't think it's a silly thing to say we want to have working family childcare entitlements because we want to encourage and support those parents into work. But particularly these newest entitlements, which are for working families, that is much more on that kind of growth and employment and labor supply and family income side of the ledger than it is on this opportunity. Let's really focus on the most disadvantaged side of the ledger. And I think the risk there is you hand this quite chunky, quite expensive policy to DFE and say, you're administering this, you're leading on this. At the same time, you tell DFE you're the opportunity mission department, your job is to get 75% of 5-year-olds reaching a good level of development. And DFE sits there and goes, well, we're spending a lot on these new entitlements. We're actually spending a lot more than we thought we would be on these new entitlements. And to what extent is that crowding out both the money and the sort of policy-making headspace to really think more broadly about that opportunity mission? I think that's where my worry comes.
I mean, that's a fascinating insight, Ed, to how important the centre of government, number 10, number 11, are to this and the sets of choices that we have. And Christine, I mean, it's very striking, as you say, that the choice that has been made over the last significant period of time is really for these universal childcare programs, or indeed childcare programs aimed at people or families of people in work, which is genuinely quite different from the focus of the Sure Start. But there's another. We probably need to start drawing this to an end, but there is another choice here, isn't there? And the big choice that we keep hearing about, and that it is in terms of a way of addressing child poverty, is to get rid of the 2-child limit on benefits. And there appears to be quite a big discussion going on within the government at the moment. The 2-child limit meaning, as I'm sure listeners are aware, that if you are on welfare benefits, tax credits, universal credit, you get benefits for your first 2 children, but if you have third or subsequent children, the amount of benefit you get doesn't increase. And that actually pushes quite a lot of large families into poverty. So, Christine, I know you've been thinking about this. There are choices for government, and to get rid of the 2-child limit would cost something like £3 billion a year in the long run. So that's a big that would be a big commitment, and reinvigorating Sure Start at the same level as it was would not be dissimilar in terms of scale. How do you think about that choice?
It really comes down to what your priorities actually are as a politician in those circumstances. So if what you care about is child poverty in and of itself, if you think that it's morally wrong or socially wrong or just actively undesirable that children are growing up in poor families and poor households, then there's no question the 2-child limit is the most efficient way of lifting the highest number of children out of poverty for the lowest cost per child lifted out of poverty. And that's across quite a wide range of policies, not just comparing to Sure Start. So that's, if you care about child poverty, that's a really efficient way to go. But if you have a sort of broader focus, if you care more about the impact of poverty on those children or about the outcomes that those children go on to have, then the evidence base is a lot murkier. So what we have from this study today is we have now pretty good evidence that Sure Start improves those children's outcomes across a wide range of dimensions. And by the way, not just for poor children, but for quite a large proportion of the population. When we look instead at the 2-child limit, we don't have in the UK yet good quantitative evidence showing the causal impact of the 2-child limit on the outcomes of children and their families. That work is in progress, so colleagues at IFS are carrying out that evaluation, and we'll know a lot more once they finish that work. But for now, there's a bit of a question mark here. And stepping back, that matters because when we think about poverty, what we know is that children who grow up in families grow up in poverty have far worse outcomes than children who grow up in families with higher income. That correlation is really, really strong. But that's a different question from asking what's actually the causal impact of income in those families. Is this something about the income and the resources themselves, or is there a whole bunch of other stuff happening in these households that's contributing to those differences in outcomes? And in some sense, that sounds like a really silly question to ask because, of course, more income is better. And of course, we think that people have an easier life when they have more income. But, we do have to kind of evidence this, and income policies tend to be quite expensive. Giving families income tends to be quite an expensive thing to do. So the bar for evidence is reasonably high. So what we can try and do there is we can try and learn from the international evidence base in other high income countries. And there actually what you find is the evidence base is somewhat mixed. So there's lots of kind of observational studies, correlational studies that predictably show kids growing up in poverty have worse outcomes. When you try and move towards more causal research, there's a much more mixed picture and a much more challenging picture. So, for example, there's a set of studies coming out of the US right now where families are enrolled in randomized controlled trials, and half the families are sort of randomly chosen to get pretty chunky transfers of cash, unconditional transfers of cash, just a check in the post, or more likely a transfer to their bank account. And the other group of families don't receive that same level of support. And those studies are finding in those kind of early results that they're releasing, they're not finding huge differences in the outcomes of children in the families who are getting the extra cash versus the families who aren't. And that's across quite a wide range of outcomes, and they're sort of pre-registered. So this is really high quality research. And that means it's a pretty challenging finding for people who are particularly worried or particularly concerned about the impact of the two-child limit itself. But there are a couple of limitations to this evidence base as well. So a lot of the studies and a lot of the research that's out there now focuses on the impact of cash transfers in the earliest years of life, that kind of 0 to 5 or conception to 5 range. We know less about the impact of getting those income shocks or of having a higher income at different stages of children's development. It might be that this matters a lot more when children are a little bit older, and there are potentially more things that families can do, more things that cost money that families want to buy that would make a difference in their child's life. So that's kind of one question. The other question that we have is really about perspective and what it is that we care about. So we've talked a lot about the children's outcomes themselves. It might well be that there are other outcomes and other people who matter here as well. We know from some work, for example, that when families' food stamps are cut or sort of vouchers that they get to help them buy healthy food are cut back in the US, mothers step in and fill that gap. And so mothers eat less healthily, mothers eat less, just full stop, but they protect the amount of food that their children are able to eat. And so you might think that there's something similar going on here as well, that these families are on lower incomes than they otherwise would be, but that they're working really, really hard to protect their children from the impacts of that. And that might be one of the reasons that we're not seeing such big differences in the outcomes once we do, of specifically the children, once we do ease that budget constraint, or we do ensure that a bit more income makes it to that family.
Christine, let's imagine you're the Chancellor and you've read your report in detail, and you've kind of looked at all of the underlying data, and so you really know it in detail, but you also know the evidence, and you're thinking, I'm taking a 10-year view, not a 2-year view, but I want to spend to save. I'm looking for the thing which will really deliver me as Chancellor the biggest long-term savings. Am I going to get bigger long-term savings by reducing income poverty through the two-child limit, or will I get bigger long-term savings for the exchequer and for society more widely from investing in SureStart?
So we don't have a super high quality evaluation of the two-child limit.
But you're the Chancellor, so you got to do it anyway.
But I'm the Chancellor, so I'm gonna try and make this decision. And I think I'm looking at that and I'm saying, SureStart, we have good evidence that SureStart delivers these long-term benefits, and the evidence from around the world on programs that give families direct cash benefits, unconditional cash benefits, is much weaker. And I think I'm then looking at that and saying, are there services, are there ways that we can enhance the SureStart offer to raise those benefits even more, or signpost families into getting the level of benefits that they are? There's a lot of levers within that. But I think on the quality of the evidence that we have right now, we've got good evidence for long-term benefits for children on the family services side. The evidence we have on unconditional cash transfers is a little bit weaker.
That's really interesting. And I guess quite a lot of people might be a little bit surprised by that, in the sense that, do we know why increasing? I mean, you'd think that increasing the income of families that have got children are really poor would have some long-term benefits. So do we know why these studies are not finding that, or are we just sort of left with the fact that they're not finding it?
I think we're still sort of early days. So there's actually work going on at IFS right now to evaluate the impact of the 2-child limit on families and children. And I think that when we have the answers to that, we'll be in a much better position to answer some of these questions. But ultimately, a big question on policy making is what level and where is that difference made and what constraints is it easing? So if you're doing something like Sure Start, you're by and large building new services that families didn't have access to before. And hopefully you're drawing on sort of best quality evidence to find things that we know make a difference. If you're giving families income, you're easing a lot of their budget constraints, but it's a little bit harder to know at what level you need to do that. How does that get spent? There's lots of people in the household. So if you specifically care about the sort of under twos, what share of that income are they getting, or how do households make those decisions? So you're intervening at different levels, looking at sort of specific services to a child versus give families cash and trust them to make their own best decisions in their own best interest. And I would say as well, we're talking here very specifically about children's outcomes. There's lots of other outcomes that you probably care about. And many of those are probably more affected by give families cash. So it's not that there's kind of one right answer to this. It very much depends what you're trying to achieve.
The truth is, Paul, they can make a move now on 2-child and have it enacted within some months. And it would be very surprising to me if there's not a move, although it would surprise me if they abolish the cap entirely, but they could choose to raise the limit from 2 children to 3 children, which probably wouldn't target the most at-risk families, but would be a move in that direction. But if they're going to start really going for Sure Start and learning the evidence from the evidence, that will take a lot longer. So independent of that choice, they need to get on and start doing the Sure Start work now.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, at one level, this government has already been surprisingly focused on the long term in a positive way with a lot of the planning reforms and extra investment and so on. And I guess the politics now is really focused on let's make people's lives better today, given that they've done a lot of the long term. But we're getting into really deep political and philosophical water if we start talking about that. And I think we probably ought to draw this absolutely fascinating conversation to an end. I mean, it's really interesting. I'd forgotten, Ed, that this wasn't sort of part of the original Labour Party plan in 1997. That it originated from work within the Treasury and the work that Naomi Eisenstadt and others did, and then became quite embedded, but not embedded enough to see it through a new government. But I'm really taken by your optimism about the long term. The combination of the fact that things were beginning to change a little bit under the last government, the power of Christine's work, and in the long term, we may well move to something which is more substantive than we have, because actually there is a remarkable consensus among people working in this area that these sorts of interventions are positive. So I think we'll end on that note of hope, which is, as listeners, regular listeners know, is relatively unusual for the IFS Zooms In, but we'll end on a positive note.
So, can I just say as well, thank you to you for your public service over the last 10 and more years running the IFS. And 40 years ago, we both sat together in tutorials in public economics and economic theory with Tim Besley at Keble College, Oxford. And who'd have thought 40 years on, we'd both be discussing the outcomes of public policy work we've both been involved in over that time. But I think back then we believed in kind of evidence and the empirical study of economics as a way of telling you what would work in terms of policy. And so to see work as brilliant as Christine and her team's work and the IFS backing that so strongly in this Sure Start area, I mean, that is what good economics is all about. And that's what the IFS is famous for now. And you've been a very important part of that. So thank you.
Well, that's extremely kind of you, Ed, and thank you for that. And actually, if there are any economic students or potential economic students listening, public economics is the way to go. I don't know how frequently that's offered now across universities, but if you are interested in policy and making a difference and doing good, then public economics is not only deeply fascinating, and for Ed and me, I think has been a really important part of our lives to have studied that at university, but it is the bit of economics which is about all of the things that you read about in the newspapers. It's about policy. It's about politics. And I would encourage anyone who's thinking about doing economics to think very hard about studying public economics. And who knows, one day you might be a famous podcaster like Ed, or a very, very soon to be former director of the IFS like me. Or even better, a really good researcher like Christine, who probably does more good than either of us put together. But that's the kind of thing that you can do with public economics. So thank you for that. You've interrupted my normal my normal sign off. But again, thank you to everybody who's been listening to this edition of the IFS Zooms In. If you did enjoy the episode, please do subscribe to our podcast. And share it with anyone who might be interested. And if you'd like to support our work, you can become a member for as little £10 a month. Please check the link in the episode description. Thank you again for listening, and we will see you next time.